Some men will gut you for $1. Some will step over your third leg and sleep like a baby afterwards. The truth is, you learn which kind they are, only when you're down on your knees. That lesson sat in Gideon Merritt's bones like an old scar, deep, familiar, and never wholly healed. 53 years of frontier weather had taught him how to read men, their tells, their small mercies, their betrayals. Character, he'd learned, is a thing that shows itself when a person has nothing left to lose. Spring Roundup in 1887 had the country working a man to the marrow. Dust boiled in great waves as herds moved like slow, living storms across 40,000 acres that made up the Merritt spread. Gideon rode the land with an ease born of decades, hands like old leather, face brown to mahogany from seasons in sun and wind, a man the hands called the Weather Eye, because he always guessed which way the storm would turn. That morning, amid the bellowing calves and the clink of harness, something turned wrong inside his chest. It began small, a numbness in his fingers as he reached for the canteen, not cool numb, but dead, like someone had slipped a stranger's hand on the end of his wrist. His breath began to come in short, shallow pulls. The sky, a high, clean blue, tilted. Rufus Baines. Roof, who'd worked for him longer than most, had names, caught him before he fell from the saddle. Gideon felt the ground rush up, the taste of grit in his mouth. He remembered Rufus's voice, close and thunder rough, calling for the wagon. Then black. When he opened his eyes, it was in Dr. Abel Crow's ramshackle office on Main Street in Tobin. The physician was a man of 60, with spectacles that made his eyes look like pool balls and a manner that didn't soften bad news. "Your heart," Dr. Crow said. "It's worn through like leather, riding a saddle too long." He did not mince it. Men on the frontier didn't want ceremony as much as they needed truth. "How long?" Gideon asked, voice like gravel. "A year, maybe less. Could be 3 months if you run yourself to the ground again." The prognosis landed like dust, expected, settling, heavy. Gideon had always believed a man like him would die in the saddle or on a bunkhouse cot. But in the stillness of that narrow bed, the thought stabbed him with new urgency. He had no wife, no child, no appointed heir. The Merritt Ranch, the largest operation across 3 territories, would default to his mother, Agnes Merritt, and his half-brother, Caleb. Both had circled his fortune like wolves scenting a kill. 3 weeks later, Gideon was moving again, slower, measured, but moving. He told the men he was overseeing things from Tobin while he convalesced. In truth, he watched, listened, and planned. Illness had made him less impatient and more precise. It had made him think about legacy. The Red Stag Inn stood on the corner of Main and 6th Street. Red brick, dark wood, a hulking 2-story that served as the town's social crossroad. The kitchen stew had a way of telling you everything about a place: fortitude, thrift, patience. That stew introduced Gideon to May Hollis. May was 19, from Kansas originally, solid with thick dark hair braided down her back. She was not the kind of woman poets made prettier in song. Her nose was straightforward, jaw square, hands rough with honest work. But she moved through the Red Stag with the kind of steadiness Gideon had learned was rarer than gold on the plains. She held no airs. She owned her work. On a humid Tuesday in early May, Gideon sat in his usual corner, whiskey warming his hand, though he hardly needed it. May was carrying a pot of coffee when her foot caught the leg of his chair. The pot swung like a pendulum, and a hot, thick beef stew tipped into Gideon's lap. The room stopped. The steam smelled like ruin. She froze, pale as milk, mouthing an apology. In most places, most times, that slip would have meant immediate dismissal. In winter, it would mean hunger. In her eyes, Gideon saw every calculation a young woman without family must make in a town that didn't forgive mistakes. Then he laughed, genuine, surprise-laced laughter, because the stew soaked his vest, and there was a ridiculousness to being ruined by a bowl of stew when the horizon itself could take a man. "You've done me a favor," Gideon told her, grinning. "This will keep me warm in the night." Relief crept into May's face. She wiped his shirt with an efficiency that suggested she'd been rehearsing apologies for a lifetime. She told him her name, May Hollis, and where she was from. Gideon introduced himself, extended a hand. Her palm fit his, and for the first time since the doctor's verdict had settled in his chest, something that resembled hope stirred up. After that, Gideon ate at the Red Stag often. He sat where he could see May work. She learned his order, coffee black, a plate to hold his whiskey glass, steady and simple. She tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, small gestures that told him more than a manifesto. She was disciplined, kind to the kitchen crew, strong without pretense. He watched her like a man learning a new terrain. One evening, he spoke plainly. "May, I have a proposition. It isn't romantic in the way novels make it. It's practical. I need a partner. The ranch needs someone to trust. You need shelter and a future. I want to marry you." She held the plate. "Why me?" she asked simply. "Because you're steady," he said. "Because you are real. Because you don't pretend. The frontier is no place for beauty's illusions. It's a place for steady hands." May thought, then nodded. They married in June, beneath cottonwoods that whispered in the wind. No one fussed over fine things. May wore a dark blue dress she'd altered herself. Gideon wore his best shirt. Reverend Nolan March, who knew that frontier, weddings rarely required explanations, married them with an economy of words. Rufus and 3 hands stood as witnesses. Rufus's face registered surprise, but when he pressed May's hand, he said nothing. Some men reserve comment for the work ahead. That wedding night, the Merritt house, timbered, wide-porched, chimneyed, felt vast and intimate at once. May, in a white cotton nightgown, looked younger and more vulnerable than she had in daylight. Gideon, stripped to the waist, bore the map of his life in scars and muscle. He confessed to her, not a flourish but a plain truth, that he was afraid. He was afraid of hurting her. He was afraid his heart would fail at the wrong moment. That admission undid something in May. She laughed, real and honest. They fumbled through the tender and awkward firstness of making love. May's body was strong, built for labor. At first, she was tight and cautious. Gideon, having weathered a life of rough handling, moved with a gentleness that surprised her. They learned each other slowly, like 2 people walking a ridge toward sunrise, hesitant, then sure. The discovery left them breathless and laughing, not from embarrassment, but from the kind of wonder that arrives when 2 lives click into place. In the months that followed, their pairing proved practical, as well as tender. Gideon rode out early. May kept house with a competence that surprised him. She kept the ledgers tidy, the pantry in order, and she managed the men with quiet authority. Men respected competence on a ranch more than birthright, and the hands came to answer to her as they had to Gideon. Then May told him she was with child. Gideon felt a peculiar tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the failing organ Dr. Crow had warned about. Hope arrived like a small flame. Agnes Merritt and Caleb did not receive the news gladly. Agnes, thin as a winter twig, had built the ranch's household with an iron will when Gideon's father died. Caleb, the half-brother, had a knack for being in the right place whenever inheritance required a hand. An heir upset both their tidy calculations. They schemed. On July 15th, a slick doctor from the city of Denver, well-dressed, expensive, ostensibly specialist, examined Gideon and confirmed the earlier verdict, only with a flourish. 6 months, give or take. Gideon saw the hint of triumph in Agnes's jawline and said no word. He had other things to do than argue with those who'd been counting his last pennies. He spent the next weeks arranging his affairs quietly. He entrusted Rufus with running the spread if something happened. He drew up a will that left everything to May and to any child born of their union. He told May not to worry. He promised to return from a short business ride to close a grazing rights deal with the Pacific and Western Railway. He kissed her goodbye and rode. He never made it home. The wagon overturned near Raven's Hollow, 40 miles north. When Eli, Pendry found him, Gideon was wedged under the frame, leg double broken, head cut, fever burning. Eli took him to a small ranch where he and his wife Mabel nursed him. For 3 weeks, Gideon hung close to death. Fever stole 17 pounds from his body. Delirium made May's name the only coherent thing he could summon. Mabel wrote the syllables down and kept them in a pocket like a prayer. When the fever broke, Gideon remembered May first. He insisted he must ride home. Eli and Mabel wouldn't hear of it. The wound, they said, must heal. The leg must knit. The world could wait. Back at the Merritt house, a different story had been spun. The wrecked wagon was enough for the sheriff to pronounce Gideon dead in absentia. Agnes moved swiftly. She stripped May of her room and moved her to servants' quarters. She cut off the allowance Gideon had quietly arranged. Jasper, no, Caleb, drew the reins of the ranch tighter. The hands shifted. Some stayed, but the tenor changed. Rumors began. May had married for money. She'd plotted. People have a way of writing stories to fit their prejudices. May's life narrowed to work and the child inside her. She learned which merchants would extend credit when she brought them mended shirts. She taught the garden to squeeze life from poor soil. At night, she lay awake listening to her baby move, praying Gideon might ride back through the dust. When she tumbled down in the root cellar, dizzy and bleeding and terrified, the next weeks were a study in private endurance. When a young hand found her and helped her back to the tiny bed, he kept the incident secret. There was no pity to be traded for a rumor. By late September, she was a ghost, wearing a borrowed dress, hands cracked from work, face drawn. The town's whispers calcified into cruelty. Agnes stoked them. Caleb smiled in the right places and looked entitled in the rest. May had become the widow who wanted too much. People shy of trouble kept their distance. Those who wanted to climb used her as a stepping stone. Then, on a sharp October morning, dust whispered up a road, and a gaunt horseman appeared through the sun. Gideon rode into the yard like a man summoned back from myth. He was a skeleton wrapped in old leather. Fever had made his face caverns and his clothes hung off him. But he was alive. May's hands went white on the pump handle. He didn't dismount at once. He looked at her with a recognition that boiled into barely contained anger. "What have they done to you?" he demanded. She told him everything. The move to the servants' rooms, the stopped allowance, the way men treated her like she had no name. Gideon listened, his jaw raw with a fury that steadied into a terrible kind of resolve. He sat, breathed, and promised retribution of a sort frontier folk understand. He would take back what was his. That morning, Gideon called Agnes and Caleb into the parlor. Agnes arrived with all the cold authority of a woman who had always felt in control. Caleb looked like a man who'd never learned to wield a lariat. He was soft at the edges, untested in the work that made bones. "You're alive," Agnes said, not in delight but as a statement of fact and convenience. "I am," Gideon replied, "and I'm less inclined to die now that I've seen what happens when I'm mislaid." He named damage done, the accounts that were mismanaged, the allowances stolen, May's dignity stripped. He had a physician's note now, a real one. Dr. Crow and another had assessed him. His heart, he said plainly, was not failing. It was strong enough to keep him for a good long while. He had returned to set the ledger straight. Agnes clutched the arm of her chair as though to keep her center. Caleb stammered an excuse. Rufus, quietly present, let vengeance be Gideon's work rather than his own. Some men know when to stand in the afterwind of a storm. Gideon rehired Rufus and set to work healing more than the broken leg. He paid town debts run against May's name. He wrote checks for merchants. He rode fence lines and listened to the land as if learning it anew. More importantly, he began courting May again, not with grand speeches but with small restorations. A crate of fresh hens for the garden she'd tended through starvation months. Afternoons spent sitting at the fence bringing water as she worked, listening to her stories instead of giving orders. He asked her to help him with something in town, a boarded-up building, sound at its bones but uncared for. "Design it how you like," he said. "Run it. It will be yours." May, who'd never run a business, took to it like a woman who had been practicing discipline her whole life. The old boarding house became the hearthstone. 12 rooms, a public dining room, staff under May's brisk, fair hand. Travelers found the food good and the beds honest. The hearthstone earned its name. When May went into labor one gray morning in November, Dr. Crow and midwife Beatrice Ashby kept watch. The birth was long but uncomplicated. At 3 in the afternoon, a small dark-haired girl arrived, crying strong. May held the infant close, trembling, and whispered a name, Lila, for May's grandmother, who had once left a bowl of bread and kindness to a small girl and taught her to keep both hands busy and honest. Gideon touched Lila's wet hair and felt something in his chest close and clear like an old wound finely stitched. The house that had once seemed so large now felt exactly the right size. Life tilled itself into a new pattern. Sleep was sparse and love was patient. Gideon rose at all hours for feedings, rocked Lila under the window as May watched the stars bleed into morning. By spring, Lila was 6 months, and May was again with child. They laughed at their efficiency, at the way the land had a habit of being both unkind and fertile. The hearthstone flourished under May. She taught cooks, kept ledgers, ran accounts with an even hand. The ranch, under Gideon's careful reorganization, expanded to 50,000 acres. Word spread around 3 territories that merit hands were paid honestly and treated fairly. The family grew. Rufus became more than a hired hand. He became family. Eli, Pendry, and Mabel remained friends, often visiting with jars of preserves and hard-won gossip about neighbors. Gideon stayed until his bones felt old, but his heart remained steady. He lived long enough to hold grandchildren and to see Lila marry a neighboring rancher's son who respected work and loved stories. When he died, at 83, peacefully, with May clutching his hand, the whole territory came to the funeral. The man who had once been told his heart would fail within months had lived decades longer because he had found a reason to keep it beating. May lived to 92, tending the hearthstone for as long as her hands would allow. She kept a leather journal under her pillow, recipes, accounts, small rules for running a house, and on the last page a line written again and again. I am not beautiful. I am real. Real lasts longer than beautiful. Every spring, when the cottonwoods leafed along the creek, the Merritt place held a dance under the stars. Children chased one another with sticky, sweet faces. Someone always told the story of the stew that spilled in the Red Stag Inn. Someone always laughed until tears came. In that laughter you can hear 2 people who started with little more than grit and stubbornness and built something that outlasted them both. The frontier is harsh. It takes a queer pleasure in breaking people down. But for those who choose steadiness, who show up, who work, who practice small mercies, the frontier can also be where grace gathers like rain in a dry place. Gideon and May's story is no fairy tale. It is a ledger of ordinary bravery. It is proof that when kindness finds resolve and resolve finds kindness, the result is more durable than gold. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that steadiness matters.